Hello everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion, which is jointly hosted by the Irish Society for Behaviour Analysis, ISBA, and the Division of Behaviour Analysis of the Psychological Society of Ireland, the DBA. My name is Dave O'Regan, and I'm a behaviour analyst based in the west of Ireland, where I work as the Positive Behaviour Support Manager for an organisation called Ability West. I also chair the Positive Behaviour Support Subcommittee within ISBA, and I'm going to be facilitating the discussion today. So our topic today is providing local, timely and effective supports for people with disabilities and behaviour support needs. We've had a lot of interest in this event over the last few weeks, so we know that this is a topic that people want to hear more about. And before I introduce our panelists, I just want to start with a small bit of context. So this year marks the 30-year anniversary of the original publication of a report known as the Mansell Report, which was named after Professor Jim Mansell, who led the group that developed it. Now, this report, written in the early 1990s, outlined some clear recommendations on how to develop services that were capable of meeting people's needs locally, and how to provide additional specialist supports when needed, all with the goal of supporting people to live an ordinary life in their local community, despite those behaviour support needs. Now, while the Mansell Report was developed in the United Kingdom, a lot of its recommendations are still relevant today in an Irish context. So over the course of the next hour, we're going to discuss what we currently know about what works well for people with intellectual disabilities and behaviour support needs, and what we need to do to provide it. And we're delighted to be joined by three knowledgeable and experienced panelists who are going to guide us through the discussion today. So Professor Peter McGill, Professor Matt McLaughlin, and Dr. Ivan Yakub, you're very welcome, and thanks for giving us your time today. So to start us off, I'd like to just ask you to tell us a little bit about your background and why this is a topic that really matters to you. And I might start with you, Peter, if that's okay.
Hi, thanks, Dave, and thanks very much for inviting me to take part in this. I think, well, my background originally was as a clinical psychologist. I've worked in various respects with people with learning or intellectual disabilities in the health service in the UK and social services in the voluntary sector. But the majority of my career has been spent at the Tizard Centre at the University of Kent, which of course is the centre that Jim Mansell and Dave mentioned established in the early 1980s. And so I've collaborated with Jim over many years until his untimely death. And his work has informed my understanding of many of the issues as well. I'm retired from practice now, so I'm no longer a clinical psychologist or a behaviour analyst in terms of certification and registration, but I'm still doing some academic work in the area.
Thanks really, Peter. Matt, if I could come to you next.
Sure. Yeah. Hello, everybody. I am sort of, I guess, following in Jim Mansell's footsteps in the sense that Jim, who I never personally met, went to Cardiff University 10 years before I went there. And I had the good fortune of 10 years later working in Cardiff University Social Services with some of the people that Jim had enabled to leave Eli Hospital, etc. And that indeed is one of the experiences that encouraged me then to go on into work in clinical psychology. So I've recently just finished a 3-year period as the inaugural clinical lead of disability services in Ireland.
Thanks, William, Mac. And Ivan?
Hi, good afternoon, and thanks for inviting me this afternoon. I'm a consultant psychiatrist for people with learning disability, and I also work in a couple of very relevant roles in terms of this topic. One is that I'm a national clinical lead for MHID services in Ireland. So I'd be involved in things like the production of models of services for delivering MHID services. And I also lead a small team called NPort, who would be involved in assessing out of area placements for that have been commissioned by the HSC. So again, this sort of this particular area, particularly in people with ID, would be very pertinent in terms of all these roles.
Thanks a million, and you're all very welcome. So let's dive straight into it and think about our first question to think about. So before we start thinking about the more specialist individualized supports, the local services that we have to be broadly capable of meeting the needs of the people that they're supporting to try and prevent the development of the more significant behaviour support needs happening in the first place. And Peter, I know you've published extensively in this area, so I'm going to come to you first with this question, which is basically, what are some of the key elements to providing a capable support environment for people with those types of needs?
Okay, thanks, Dave. I think, I mean, as you say, I've published a bit in this area. I'm really glad to see this as the first question, because it does seem to me that it's very important not to start specifically from the behaviour support needs of individuals, but to start from the more general context within which behaviour that we describe as challenging develops and is maintained. So that's great. I think I'd mentioned initially 4 kinds of things that are important aspects of capable support environments. First of all, there's the stuff around individual immediate interactions between individuals with an intellectual disability and their carers or staff or whoever is in direct contact with them. And there are a range of aspects to that. I won't go into them all, but obviously things like the extent to which people get positive social interactions, the kinds of relationships that are built with people and their carers, the extent to which choice is offered, and so on. All of that is really important in terms of the immediate interactions. And of course, as people interested in this area, we all understand that the way in which those kinds of interactions contribute to, sometimes when they're not so positive, to the development of behaviour described as challenging. But it's important, I think, not to just stop at the level of the immediate interactions, but to think a bit beyond that. So, for instance, the practices and culture of the setting in which we find people with intellectual disabilities. This is the second aspect, if you like. The way in which staff are trained or managed or led. One of the concepts that's been used a lot in this area is the notion of practice leadership, the way, whether or not, and that's another concept that Jim Mansell had a great role in developing. To what extent are there positive values which are inculcated amongst the staff or others supporting the individual? So is there a positive culture with inclusive values? And then the third element to this is the wider sort of organisational context. So if we're talking, for instance, about supported living or similar, typically this is provided within a relatively large organisation, where there may be many supported living or similar kinds of placements. So it becomes important then to what extent there is leadership within that organisation, there is support within that organisation, there is understanding within that organisation of the kinds of things that are needed, of the practices, the culture, the immediate interactions. Otherwise, those things won't sustain if there isn't, if you like, sign up at the highest organisational level. And then finally, certainly in the UK, we find an increasingly fragmented picture of social care. I mean, my particular interest is adult social care, but I think it applies to other areas as well. So it's important also to think about the network of services, the pattern of services that exists within a local area, because ultimately capable environments aren't just the immediate interactions, they're the what's available within the local area to ensure that individuals and families can be adequately and properly supported. Not all services, not all supports are equal, and nor should they be, but that's where people like commissioners become very important as people who can be looking at the overall pattern supports and services available in any particular local area, and how that can be improved and set out in a way that provides the capable environments necessary for individuals, their families, and their carers.
That's really helpful, I think, to think about it, as well as beyond the kind of original published capable environments areas, the broader service context that those exist in as well is really useful, I think. Mac, would you? It's a difficult act to follow Peter McGill on capable environments, but what would you like to add?
Sure. Yeah. I think if we stand back a minute and just think of, I guess, what Jim Mansell did in his context was that at the age of 18, before he did any professional training or was socialized into a particular way of thinking, he realized that the system that was being offered by Eli Hospital was entirely inappropriate. And I think it's really important to recognize that he realized that, but neither the psychologists or the psychiatrists or the nurses or the behavior analysts or anyone else who were part of that institution recognize that. So I think an awful lot can be learned in terms of service improvement from that lived experience perspective, but also the brand newness of people's insights to things. So his visceral reaction to what he saw was one of abhorrence. And I think we need to consider, and it still happens in Ireland, the extent to which our services actually create problems for people. I would say very many of our services still traumatize people. I'm not just talking about, if you like, infamous reports like the Brandon report of recent years, but we have about 1,800 plus people in some type of institutionalized or decongregated setting. So, we are continuing to do things. So I think by all means, it's really important to highlight, as Peter has, the things around, for instance, assisted decision making, as Peter mentioned, and reasonable accommodation so that people can meaningfully participate in their community, etc. But we also need to be really aware of what we are doing right now that's actually producing behavioral problems and mental health problems. That they're not an unfortunate byproduct of going through the system. The system is sort of designed to make those things happen. So I think, is in addition to what Peter's mentioned there, and something I might mention a few times today actually, is I would like to see all members of community teams working in a much more psychologically minded way, being much more alive to the sort of environmental contingencies and contexts that actually prime problems for people, rather than, and not instead of, but rather than it being solely the area of, say, behavior analysts or psychologists or psychiatrists. I feel everyone working on community teams should be psychologically minded.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I'm sure it's something we want to come back to across the course of the hour. Thank you for that, Mac. And Ivan?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think, we do have an awful lot of data that would help us, help guide us in terms of kind of planning and providing capable environments in the future. But I think our systems really struggle with doing that. And often what we find is that we end up kind of reacting and firefighting. And I think that ends up, producing very problematic results. There's a lot of things in the kind of public system which stops us really from being able, when we know what need is coming down the line, we can, for example, I have I've seen a really good report that was written a few years ago predicting very clearly what was going to happen in terms of the number of referrals of people with ASD to services. And yet we find ourselves currently in the situation where it's actually, proven very difficult to sort of provide, the services that we need. I think that, if we had a system that allowed us to kind of plan ahead, go in and procure the kind of the sort of housing that we need, recruit the staffing that we need, train the staffing in the way that in a way that they could support people, individuals who present with complex behavior. I think then we could be a lot more proactive rather than responsive in how we provide the services. I find it very interesting actually that the most recent kind of care planning meeting I was involved in just there on Tuesday was for somebody whom previously was presenting with incredibly kind of distressed and sort of challenging and complex behavior, and now is doing incredibly well. And when we step back and look at what's happened, it was really about the environment and the mix of people supported, and that's enabled this particular individual's quality of life to blossom, and the amount of medication that she's on to reduce markedly. And I think when we talk about biopsychosocial models, actually I increasingly wonder whether we ought to reframe that as social first, because I think that you kind of start off with the capable and the correct environment before you even sort of approach the other elements of the service that you provide.
That's another excellent point to make again, in terms of I think it's something again we might be touching on across the course of the hour, but there's a number of things that are from 30 years ago in the Mansell Report that we're talking about right now that we still need to try and change and realize. So that's in some ways disheartening, but in another way we go, I think. So moving on and building on from that, and I might come to you first on this one, Mac, based on what you were saying there in the last question. When we're moving on to the more specialist supports then for people with behaviour support needs, I guess what are the kind of competencies and skill sets that we need in that wider multidisciplinary team person? And maybe based on what you're saying, maybe more the approach rather than necessarily the disciplines.
Sure. I just want to say that Ivan must have been listening in on my lecture today, because I was talking about the socio-psychobiome model. But
rebranding it today.
So in terms of sort of specialist supports, maybe I can just start by saying some of the things that are sort of currently happening in terms of specific skills. Clearly, the area of ABA is absolutely key, and one of the things that we've done over the past number of years is to develop a new framework, which is called DRESS, which is Disability Regional Enhanced Supports and Services. And so when Ireland moves into the 6 health regions, as I believe we will do early next year, the idea is that for both community primary care teams and for children's disability network teams and adult teams where they exist, that there would be, if you like, an additional layer, which would be this enhanced supports and services. So at the moment, we've developed recommendations on complex behavior, as it's called, on FEDS, on feeding, eating, drinking, and swallowing, and then thirdly on motor management. So there would be a regional team specializing in these areas in each of the 6 regions. And as I say, they would be providing support to, and very importantly, not necessarily taking referrals from, but rather reaching in to whether it's CDNTs or indeed it may also be MHID teams or CANS teams or community teams. So this would combine expertise from the whole range of professions, and we would also hope that it would chime with other work on collaborative and proactive solutions that some of you might be familiar with. So Toby Sachenmeyer is piloting some work in this area in CHO 2 and 3. again, that's really to get people thinking more psychologically at the team level. And one of the things I would love to see in terms of strengthening skills in that area would be a bit of coming together from the sort of positive behavioural supports perspective, which certainly relates to the environment very strongly. And then also the sort of collaborative and proactive solutions perspective, you know, which also has that ethos. So I think if this isn't too provocative, one of the things I'd like to see is us having fewer sort of psychological or behavioral tribes and trying to find more common ways to help teams work with people in a much more psychologically minded way. But to be very specific to your question, of course, the skills around applied behavior analysis are going to be very key, both in terms of those enhanced, those DRESS teams, and of course at the more immediate community level.
I think one of the kind of tricky parts, I suppose, we have at the moment in Ireland, and I know there's moves with the UKSBA in England and within the UK towards addressing this, but in Ireland at the moment we've got no agreed standards for qualifications, experience, supervision or CPD requirements for people who are termed behaviour support specialists or behaviour therapists. And do you think that leads, I guess, where are the risks to that, Mac, in terms of the supports provided to people, and where do we need to go with that?
Yeah, I think it both disorientates the service users and it disorientates the service providers, so that we need a clearer standardized approach. And standardized, that doesn't mean uniform, but it means the same sort of standards of service can be provided in different areas within the country. And Dave, as you know very well, but both yourself and other members from the behaviour analyst community have been working with the clinical programme for people with disability to develop a framework that would allow commonalities and alignments between different types of specialist posts, whether it's for instance through psychology or nursing or social work or whatever, but also importantly a clearer sort of career structure. And an additional element, which I think is very important, is where there would be perhaps a new cadre introduced with people with perhaps shorter training who would work to support behavioural analysts and other members of a sort of interdisciplinary team as well. So yeah, I think it's sort of emblematic of the problems of the system that we have a disorientated career structure, and we don't know what to expect from people even at the same grade, because they may have very different training. So I think we owe it to ourselves, but certainly the service users, to standardize and make it what most people outside the system would expect to exist, but doesn't exist at the moment. Thanks
a million, Mac. I know there was an acronym soup there, Peter, in terms of community network teams and community healthcare organizations. But broadly, the special supports that people receive, what are the kind of key competencies and skill sets needed to provide that additional special support when people need it?
Yeah, I mean, I entirely agree about the importance of the focus on positive behaviour support or ABA or however it's defined. And clearly there is a need to better standardise, in a sense, the backgrounds and the training and the experience that people filling those posts have, and that's the same issue in the UK. Although I think the development of the UK Behaviour Analysis Society certificate is a step in the right direction there, and potentially might help to standardise that. I think it's worth drawing attention. I thought Mac's point about the links with other professions is really important. I mean, going back a long way to the days when intellectual disability was seen as something that required nurses to provide support to people, and then social workers were increasingly getting involved, and there were a lot of problems between nurses and social workers. One of the focuses at that time was on interprofessional development and working, and trying to ensure that people understood the different roles that the different professionals had. I think one potential criticism that could be made of the development of behaviour analysis and behaviour analysts is that it's not always attended to those issues as well as it might have done. So sometimes it's taken a rather, in my view, overly technical perspective on developing understanding of behaviour analytic principles and treatment and assessments and interventions and so on, all of which is extremely important, but has failed to take account as much as it perhaps should have done of some of the more general issues that arise in working with people, especially working with people with the kinds of complex behaviours that we're talking about. So maybe I just mention a couple of things which I think are behaviour analysts, and perhaps in particular, but also professions generally, should be thinking about. Most of the time, behaviour analysts work with individuals. They get a referral, they conduct an assessment, etc., etc. They don't always have a very good understanding, it seems to me, of the systems within which problems arise and are maintained. And I would like to see a more systemic focus within that kind of provision, where behaviour analysts and others are always thinking about, well, how could this have been prevented? How could we have managed to not get here? What are the implications of this, the individual I'm working with, and the issues they're facing for other people, for the rest of the service? And that requires skills in getting yourself into positions within organisations where you are able to facilitate dialogue between different bits of that organisation, where you don't become a kind of separated on your own, burrowing away, doing functional assessments, but you are actually thinking about how can I disseminate the information I'm getting from individual work up to the managers, to the leaders of the organisation, to try and ensure that those things can be prevented. And then a second element, in a sense relatedly, another kind of professional skill, or not just for behaviour analysts, is about implementation. Too often we see very good behaviour support plans that simply aren't implemented, and they may well have been developed perfectly well, and they may well be technically correct, but if they're not implemented, they of course aren't going to have any impact on the individual's behaviour or quality of life. And there are a whole variety of reasons why they're not implemented, some of which are more technical, but I think more generally, we need to be paying more attention to those kinds of issues, to how we can ensure that we can provide the training, the understanding, the support, to ensure the monitoring, to ensure that when we come up with some sort of intervention that might be effective, that it actually is fully implemented. Otherwise, we're simply failing many of the people that we're seeking to assist and support. I think leave it there for the moment.
Yeah, I think those are all excellent points. I think there's a lot of interplay between the capable environments model, the setting-wide PBS tiered approach, kind of organizational approaches to systems change, and again, much more stuff which I know you've published on in the past, Peter. And within, when we host this on our website, we'll have links to some additional papers if people want to read more about that information as well. And let's go to you, Evan, then, in terms of that question about that specialised supports, the competencies, the skill sets. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to sort of talk a little bit about specialized supports, but I think that it's also very important to talk about the kind of, frontline staffing as well, because I think that's really key. I mean, I was delighted when Sharing a Vision ensured that speech and language therapists were a core member of MHID teams, which A Vision for Change hadn't, and had put them in as auxiliary members. Because I think that, it's absolutely sort of imperative that you do have, those multidisciplinary supports. And often, referrals for people who present with severe challenging behaviors and complex behaviors, sort of come to psychology and psychiatry. But in fact, communication elements, for example, or even activity planning and structured activities, which our OT colleagues are sort of excellent at sort of assessing and making recommendations in relation to, are absolutely pivotal in terms of supporting individuals. But I will say that I think I think sometimes we kind of forget about the sort of the frontline structures, because I see the idea of the kind of role of working a long day, 12-hour shift or whatever it is, with somebody who presents with very complex and behaviors that challenge. I think it's I do think it's a vocation. I think it's a a complex role, and I think that I'm not sure that organizations are always able to kind of support and nurture these individuals in terms of training, specialist training, in terms of governance and line management and so on. Because I think if you do have in the sort of frontline staff that are able to sort of complete those whether they're ABC charts or other monitoring charts to a high standard, that feel supported and listened to when they if they're in a difficult situation. And I'll go back to Peter's point that about implementation. It's very important to support the frontline staff. If the behavior support plan suggests that there are periods where this particular amount of staffing is required, it's very important that the management of the frontline staff is able to provide that. Otherwise, that behavior support plan is just going to gather dust, really, and it's not going to be implemented. So I think that's a whole system working together, where you've got supported frontline staff who are supported by their line management, but also by the multidisciplinary team with their sort of specialist skills that are going to work together in order to provide that good quality of life for the people we support.
Mm-hmm. I think there's so much interplay between all these different areas in this discussion. And I was at the EABG conference in Bangor, North Wales, in September, and I saw Steve Noon presenting about the workforce development strategy put in place up in the Northeast. And he was saying one of the learning points he took from it was, rather than towards the end working on supporting staff, this is the mindful skilled care as part of the capable environments model. So rather than at the end of their workforce development strategy, working on supporting staff with the experience of being challenged, that should have been a front-loaded piece of support for staff. So it's back to the kind of preventative idea that instead of after the fact having a debriefing session about an incident that was difficult, having upfront support with the psychological experience of being challenged, what that would do to you personally, and having strategies to deal with that when it comes up, which it inevitably will. And that's another thing that I think we've been short on doing, we haven't done enough of, and we're putting people in difficult situations who are the key people who make the plans happen, and they can't happen without them, and yet they don't necessarily have the types of supports that they need to be able to cope with what they're faced with, and that might lead to burnout, and might lead to turnover, and leads to more and more problems sitting up. I don't know if anybody wants to come in on that idea that just arrived in my head right now, on that idea of providing more support, mindful skilled carers. It's like the last one of the 10 areas in the capable environments paper. To me, it underpins all the areas. Peter, you might want to come in on that.
Well, I completely agree with that, Dave, and the points that Ivan was making. I mean, there's really not a lot of research on this, I don't think. I've had a few people who've looked at done things like interview staff, direct care staff, frontline staff, about their experiences of trying to implement behaviour support plans, including actually one Irish PhD student I co-supervised. And there are often many issues involved in that process that aren't really being dealt with adequately by the professionals involved. Some of which are the sort of organisational things that I think Ivan referred to, the insufficient staff or insufficient support for those staff. Some of which are the more technical things, like simply not really having the skill or the training to carry out the task that they're being asked to carry out. Sometimes it's people who actually disagree with what they're being asked to do, and that isn't being adequately addressed, whether that's not confronted but considered and managed in some kind of way. And so there are a whole set of processes involved there that make the implementation process relatively tricky, and that also, going back to what I was saying earlier, make it even more important that the people seeking to have something implemented have got good skills and understanding in those areas.
Thanks for that, Peter. So I might stick with you, Ivan, again, because your national clinical lead role in mental health and ID is a really relevant role for this question. Thinking about the kind of tenets of the Mansell Report originally, the provision of local effective service. So what would you say, giving an overview of service provision in Ireland? What are the barriers to providing local service? And what are the risks of moving in a service that's away from your local community?
Yeah, sorry, there was a bit of feedback there. So so this is in relation to providing appropriate local support and why some people end up out of area.
Yeah, and the risks for that for people living in service for the community.
Yeah, I think that it's very important to take a kind of a sort of, to sort of sit back and look at the whole picture, because I think it's very easy for there to be a narrative that local is the only option and public is the only option, and that everything else happening anything else happening is disastrous. And I think one of the things that it's been very useful to do bits of work around this, which is that obviously you want people to be supported locally, and you want them to maintain their sort of family supports and local supports. Absolutely. I think that there are some circumstances where, if there is enough of a kind of a crisis and sufficient distress, and there is very significant breakdown in terms of the relationships and the interfaces between the individuals and their the natural supports, I think that there may be circumstances where a brief period somewhere, which might be local if possible, or might be private, it might be out of area, it might be public or out of area, might be okay. I think the main problem that we've had when we've done these bits of work is that what happens is there's a massive crisis and people end up out of area, and instead of people seeing it as an emergency response or a crisis response, it becomes some kind of new home. And not only that, you have huge problems in terms of oversight. We can sometimes be very quick at sending people away from home because their placement's broken down, and the only provider that's able to provide a package is several hundred kilometers away. And then there isn't, because there's often the people who fall between the gaps that end up out of area. So there might be the people with, for example, neurodevelopmental diagnoses rather than a sort of a major mental illness diagnosis, or it might be somebody with an acquired brain injury, or it might be, or people with ASD, but where their IQ scores might fall over the over 70, and then there aren't really the structures to say, well, who's going to be monitoring this and what's going to be the process to enable that individual to return home. So yeah, I think I think there is a piece around, obviously we need to be providing appropriate local services. And we know that there are huge issues with that. We know that we have huge issues in terms of recruitment, in terms of retention, and we've talked a little bit about why that might be already today. But I think that where we have circumstances where people do, reluctantly kind of, end up out of area, it's very, very important to have the structures around the oversight and around care planning so people can return home. It's a bit like if there is an inpatient admission, your discharge planning starts the first day. If there is an out-of-area placement, your care planning around the return to the locality should start on the first day.
Excellent points. And I think my own experience, having previously worked for a private profit-making provider that provided those types of supports in England, was, and it comes back to the capable environments point to begin with, sometimes people come into those environments that aren't that well set up to support them well, and things deteriorate, and they remain in that environment because things have deteriorated, and the narrative is, oh, we can't move home until the person is settled or stabilized or has improved in some way. So that's a real barrier, I think, too. Matt, would you come in on that then, in terms of that question about barriers to providing local support?
Yeah, so I've been trying to think of each of these again in relation to Jim Mansell, and one of the things that always stuck with me was that when the first residents of Ely Hospital were let go, that the medical superintendent in charge of the hospital then predicted that they would all be back within a week. I think something like 30 years later, none of them had gone back. And it's not a thing about the medical superintendent, it's a thing again about the professions, that we are socialized into expectations. And I think in terms of barriers, if we leave aside for a moment our Dysfunctional Disability Act and the fact that we have about a third of positions vacant within disability services at the moment, if we leave those things aside, which are obviously major structural issues, again, it's for me, it's the professions and service sectors create the barriers. They're not created by the people who want to use the service. So we are designing difficulties in terms of barriers into accessing local supports. So one of the areas I continue to work with the HSE on is on the new protocol for autism assessment and intervention. And in that, I'm part of the service improvement program for the Autistic Community Board. And I think it's true to say the biggest problem that we have there is the interaction between disability and mental health services, also sometimes primary care services. But within mental health services, it's a particular challenge. And it's a challenge because both disability and mental health services have got way too much demand on them and way too few resources. And so it makes people try and defend what they think they can sort of manage. And unfortunately, the poor service user gets sort of bounced around. But there's also a very different ethos. Now, just to say, I've been extremely lucky to work with psychiatrists like Ivan or Amir Niazi or Mandy Burke, who are the child and adult clinical leads across mental health. But they themselves, even though they're very progressive, are working in a structure where the medical model is extremely dominant within mental health. So all the clinical leads are from medicine. All the executive clinical directors are from medicine. The College of Psychiatrists has a huge influence, and so on. And so you have different expectations about how people should be helped. So if, for instance, somebody has an intellectual or learning disability and they have ADHD and they have anxiety, in our system at the moment, they would be treated by 3 different teams, which is complete madness. These 3 different teams often don't actually exist, which means that they might be helped by one team and they're waiting on someone else to do those other things. So this idea of carving people up into things that suits professions or different services is, I think, really abhorrent. They're barriers that we've introduced. And I'd love to see a much more integrated approach whereby, for instance, we might have assessment centres across mental health and disability. The idea of, for instance, ADHD being in mental health and autism being in disability, when we know about the high prevalence of co-occurrence, again, we could not have designed a worst way to do things. So I think there's very different things to do it, ways to do it. As you know, within disability services, all the clinical teams are competency led by any sort of profession. And in our disability advisory group, we have all the professions involved in the service, as well as a lot of service users and lived experience presented. So I think I guess with this question, I was a bit afraid that we'd be focusing too much on narrow technical issues, which for me are the consequence of very poorly designed services and the structural barriers that we ourselves create. And I say we, because I'm sure some people are listening to this and saying, I didn't design this, it's not my fault. I think we are all colluding in this, in that we're going along with it because it's too difficult to change, or there's too many power interests involved, and I don't think that's good enough. I think that we really need to say that the way in which systems are designed now is not appropriate. It's not humane, and we need to rethink, particularly as we have scarce resources. Scarce resources can't be an excuse for sort of paralysis in service development.
Don't hold back on Nick.
I was going to say sorry about that, but
I think broadly the summary for that is to say that systems and supports don't design themselves, and yet sometimes we behave as though they do. It's like this is the existing thing, and we have to work within it, and we have to be more creative and think outside what we have, I think.
Yep.
Peter, would you have anything to add on that point about that provision of local supports, any barriers, any kind of other considerations?
Well, just a couple of things. One, just a comment arising from what Mac's been saying. I've recently been reading a book called Learning Disability and Inclusion Phobia by Christopher Goody, who's a historian of learning disability. And essentially his argument is that that we don't exclude people because of their behaviour or because of the severity of their disability or whatever, their complex needs. We exclude people because we are phobic about including them. And to some extent, I think that there's some validity in that argument. I mean, why is it that we can find places in other areas of the country that are, quotes, appropriate for this individual, but we can't find places locally? What's different about those other areas of the country? Typically, it's things like property is cheaper. It's out of sight, out of mind. It's possible to get rid of the impact that the individual has in terms of the demands made on local services. And just a couple of further observations. I've recently been involved in some research looking at transition from out of area residential schools and colleges in England, where there are still significant numbers of children and young people going off to residential schools and colleges. We looked at the transitions of over 300 of those young people into adult services. Almost 40% of them moved on to out of area settings. So, people who had already spent significant periods of time of their educational lives out of area, away from their local areas, were moving on now to continued out of area existences. And these were the risk factors for those individuals were people with more severe disabilities, people who had a diagnosis of autism, people who displayed challenging behaviour, the typical kinds of risk factors that indicate what's often missing locally in terms of the kinds of services that are needed and supports that are needed to enable people to return to their local areas. And when you ask people about, as we did, we explored a number of the transitions in rather more detail. The kinds of things that come up are an absence of suitable local housing or health service input or other kinds of services required to meet the person's needs. And also very poor transition planning. I think Yvonne mentioned earlier the idea that that we could do with a system to plan ahead, which in a sense is almost laughable when you think about it. It's even more laughable when you think about an individual who's perhaps been in a residential school for several years, and yet we still can't plan ahead to ensure that young person can transition at the time they're due to transition into adult support. And often the planning for that process doesn't even start until a few months before they've got to leave that setting.
And again, that underlines again that these issues span from the frontline staff member and that individual moment with the person they're supporting up to the very top of systems design in the first place, which again shows that there are issues to be addressed at every level of that system, I think. So we're coming towards the end of our hour. So to give you a chance, this might be a difficult question, okay? Given all the things we've spoken about in the last 50 minutes, what would be the first thing you would do to improve access to local, timely, effective special supports if you could click your fingers and make one thing happen? Might be hard to narrow it down to one, might be impossible, but I'll start with you, Peter, and see if there's anything you can think of.
Okay, well, in a sense, I think this is dead simple, and I'm glad I've got it first because I can give the dead simple answer, and then perhaps the more complicated things can leave to Mac and Ivan. Seems to me the first thing I would do is I would talk to the individuals and the families and the carers who need the local supports or who are already receiving some local supports, and ask them what their experiences are and what they want. There are lots of fancy things that one could dream up, but ultimately the place to start from is what people say their experiences are and what they say they want and need, and then drawing those people in so that any developments and changes that are made can be co-produced with those individuals and the families and carers.
That's an excellent, concise and super suggestion. Thanks a million, Peter. Ivan, we'll come to you next.
I think probably just to go back to the point I made earlier around being able to plan ahead. I think that if we introduce something like sort of multi-annual planning into our system, so we sit down with the data and we say what's going to be, how many extra residential, respite, day service services are we going to need over the next few years? What, in terms of extra staffing, what we're going to need in terms of extra vehicles? Because there's a whole infrastructure here. It's not just about the kind of, the housing and the staffing. There's also, things like, transport and day service and respite. And actually just say, well, this is what we're going to need for the next 5 years. We'll go and get it now. And, I think one of the things that stops that in the system is that obviously there are all sorts of kind of financial regulations in place and financial governance and so on, which means that the push is to try and come out in the black of year on year. But the reality is what that leaves us vulnerable to is this constant state of reactivity, and as a result, you end up kind of reacting to the absolutely most serious, most urgent cases. And meanwhile, I mean, as we come across carers in absolutely dire situations, and just because what they're facing isn't kind of headline making in the sense of, maybe, a degree of aggression or self-injury that might get somebody to land up in A&E, their needs are kind of a sort of maybe not ignored, but certainly not prioritized. And I think having services having that flexibility to be able to plan ahead, so so they're able to deliver the services as required rather than firefighting all the time. I think that would be a very key sort of intervention.
Yeah, because that sums up the nature of the day-to-day for people in our positions at the moment, doesn't it? Firefighting and never having those forward planning options available to us. And Mac, I'll give you the last word on that one.
Okay, so if I had magic wand, click my fingers, I would have the electronic health record system working tomorrow. I wouldn't have a system where we need to post a file from disability to mental health services so that we can facilitate a referral. And along with the electronic health record system, I would have the professions and the unions super enthusiastic about new digital services, and how digital can actually replace some of the functions that clinicians have often spent a lot of time on, thus freeing up those clinicians to have a much stronger input into interventions. I know I was in the UK recently, and it was announced that, for instance, they're going to double the number of doctors in training. And someone I was sitting beside at a WHO meeting last week said to me, that won't make any difference whatsoever, because the system at the moment can't afford the health personnel. So making things even less affordable, will not be a solution. What we need to do is start thinking and doing things in different ways. And like, digital is here, it's going to do amazing things, and we have to find ways of embracing it. So that's probably going to be very unpopular, but there we go.
What I love there is about 3 different areas of focus that are all make a massive difference. So just before we finish up, I've got a few final remarks to make myself. So first off, ISBA and the DBA organising events. We'll continue to organise events to discuss important topics. Keep an eye on our social media channels to see when they get advertised. And then ISBA, the Irish Society for Behaviour Analysis, are hosting an open community day next April, Thursday, the 11th of April, looking at the practical applications of behavioural science in our communities. And the annual DBA, Division of Behaviour Analysis, is taking place the same week on the 12th and 13th of April, both in Galway. So that's 2 great events coming up next year. And as well, kind of in line with the timeliness of this discussion and how important it is, the National Disability Authority in Ireland have issued a call for proposals to produce a review on the causes, prevention and management of crisis situations among young disabled people. That closes next week on the 17th of November. So we welcome the continued focus and look forward to the outcome of that process. And finally, just to thank Alan Tennyson, who was working in the background here on behalf of ISBA, who put a lot of work into setting this up in the first place. So thank you, Alan, for that. And finally, we're really grateful, Peter, Mac, and Ivan, for you giving us your time. And I've spoken to you for about 10 hours about that, I think. So thank you for your time, and thank you to everyone who's attended today. We hope to see you again at one of our events in the future. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave, and thanks, Alan. Yeah.
Cheers.
We'll let you drive off, Ivan.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Nice to meet you, Peter. Yeah.
Cheers. Bye-bye.